under a gray northern sky in the spring of 1939. A set of long wooden barracks rose among pine trees near the village of Fürstenberg, Germany. Just beyond the edge of a silent lake in a patch of swampy forest, construction crews raised fences, guard towers, and gates. These structures were not built to house soldiers, nor to defend the Reich from invasion. They were built to contain, humiliate, and slowly annihilate the people the Nazi state considered undesirable. This was Ravensbrück, the only major Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. Over the next 6 years, this remote facility would expand from a modest prison into a vast complex of torment, death, and forced labor. It would hold more than 130,000 women and children, along with several thousand men. By war's end, tens of thousands would be dead, their names erased, their bodies burned, their stories nearly lost. Ravensbrück was never as large as Auschwitz, nor as infamous as Buchenwald, but it was uniquely horrifying in its focus. A system engineered to destroy women's bodies, silence their voices, and grind away their humanity under a regime that believed obedience and suffering were female virtue. The origins of Ravensbrück trace back to the consolidation of Nazi power. After Adolf Hitler's rise in 1933, the regime moved quickly to expand its network of camps. The goal was to remove, contain, and neutralize political enemies, so-called asocials, Jews, Roma, and other marginalized groups. Under the oversight of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, this system of confinement became a tool not just for punishment, but for social engineering. By the late 1930s, existing facilities like Lichtenberg, one of the first concentration camps to hold women, had become overcrowded. The Nazi regime sought a centralized camp solely for female prisoners, one that could also serve as a model of control, exploitation, and ideological purity. In November 1938, construction began near the village of Ravensbrück, approximately 90 kilometers north of Berlin. The site was chosen for its seclusion and accessibility, close enough to the capital for bureaucratic convenience, but far enough to avoid public scrutiny. The first female prisoners arrived in May 1939. Initially, the camp had 18 barracks and was designed to hold around 6,000 inmates. But as Germany plunged into war, the camp expanded rapidly. Over the next 6 years, it would develop satellite camps, factories, medical blocks, and eventually a crematorium and gas chamber. By the end of the war, Ravensbrück was a sprawling complex housing more than 36,000 prisoners at once, a brutal machinery of Nazi ideology, cloaked in barbed wire and smoke. From the very beginning, the population of Ravensbrück reflected the Nazi obsession with control. The earliest arrivals included political prisoners, mostly German and Austrian women who opposed the regime, but the definition of enemy widened quickly. SS records later classified inmates into categories: politicals, socialists, communists, and resistors. Asocials, a vague term including prostitutes, alcoholics, Roma, homeless women, and single mothers. Race defilers, women accused of having relations with non-Aryans. Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, disabled women, and eventually foreign force laborers. By 1942, the camp began receiving large transports from occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. The demographics shifted again as French resistance fighters, Hungarians, Yugoslav partisans, and others joined the prisoner rolls. By 1945, Ravensbrück had become a cross-section of Nazi Europe's oppressed women, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, housewives and soldiers, Christians and Jews, each stripped of identity and reduced to a number. While Ravensbrück imprisoned women, it also trained women to kill. The SS placed female guards, known as Officerinnen, in charge of daily operations, under the overall leadership of male SS commanders. These guards, often young, uneducated, and recruited from nearby towns, were indoctrinated with loyalty and cruelty. The first camp commandant was SS officer Gunther Tomaszka, followed by Max Kegel, and finally Fritz Suren, who held the post from 1942 until the camp's fall in 1945. Suren would later be convicted of war crimes and executed in France. Beneath him, the women of the SS formed a rigid caste system. Some were sadistic novices, like Irma Gress, who would go on to gain infamy at Auschwitz. Others, like Maria Mandel, showed early signs of ambition fused with brutality. To the Nazi system, female violence was not only useful, it was desirable. A woman who embraced cruelty proved herself strong, efficient, and ideologically reliable. Inmates were well aware of this dynamic. Many recalled guards changing overnight, going from indifferent to sadistic within days, driven by status, fear, or hatred. Every aspect of Ravensbruck was engineered to degrade. New arrivals were stripped, shaved, and disinfected in cold, tiled rooms. Uniforms were mismatched, often stained or infested. The barracks were overcrowded, infested with lice, and lacked sanitation. From dawn until dark, women were forced to stand in roll call formations for hours, sometimes in snow, sometimes in blistering sun. The food was starvation rations, watery soup, black bread, and weak coffee. Medical care was nearly non-existent unless you were scheduled for an experiment. Labor was constant. Initially, inmates built the camp itself. Later, they were assigned to seamstress shops, knitting and sewing military uniform, armament factories, producing weapons for the German war machine, stone quarries, hauling heavy loads until their bodies gave out. Pregnant women worked alongside the elderly. Children born in the camp rarely survived more than a few days. Sick women were often marked with silent chalk signs, meaning they would soon be sent away to euthanasia centers under Aktion T4, or simply left to die in the camp hospital, which was more morgue than clinic. By 1943, the camp had constructed its own crematorium, and later, a gas chamber disguised as a bathhouse. Ravensbruck had become not just a labor camp, but a site of execution. At Ravensbruck, life was measured in minutes, and survival was never guaranteed. For the women trapped behind its electrified fences, daily existence became a ritual of endurance, humiliation, and decay. Each morning began in darkness. At 4 a.m., a loud clang of metal on metal signaled the start of the day. Women stumbled from their bunks, wooden planks stacked 3 high, infested with lice and soaked with night sweat. They stood in the freezing air of the Appellplatz, the central roll call yard, sometimes for hours, sometimes barefoot in snow or rain. Those who collapsed during roll call were beaten, dragged, or left where they fell. The guards counted heads with military precision, though the math rarely added up. Women who had died overnight from exhaustion, diarrhea, typhus, or starvation were still counted as if alive. Bodies sometimes propped up by their barrack mates to avoid punishment. Once the numbers were recorded, the day began, not with rest or food, but with forced labor. Designed not for productivity but for punishment and control. Prisoners built roads, dug ditches, hauled stones, and unloaded coal, often without proper clothing, shoes, or tools. Later, as the war escalated, many were moved to the Siemens factory complex attached to the camp. There, they assembled electrical components for airplanes and machinery. The work was grueling, repetitive, and dangerous. Shocks, injuries, and industrial accidents were common. But injury offered no reprieve. A woman who could not work was worthless to the Reich and marked for removal. By 1942, dozens of workshops operated both inside and outside Ravensbruck's fences. Some prisoners stitched German army uniforms. Others wove blankets, twisted rope, or knotted parachute cords. Tasks chosen, ironically, because they were thought feminine. But in truth, labor was simply another form of slow death. Food rations were meager, a slice of black bread, a bowl of watery soup, sometimes moldy or crawling with maggots. The lack of calories paired with hard physical labor led to dramatic emaciation. Women's bodies withered, skin darkened, stomachs swelled, bones protruded. In photos smuggled from the camp, they looked like shadows, hollow-eyed, barefoot, wrapped in rags. Many prisoners died standing, their bodies too starved to sit or sleep. Others were sent to the Revier, the camp's so-called infirmary, where conditions were worse than in the barracks. Beds were blood-stained, bandages reused, surgeries performed without anesthetic. There, doctors experimented freely, a cruelty that will be explored in the next section. While most SS guards across the Nazi camp system were men, Ravensbrück was unique in its use of female overseers, or Aufseherinnen. These women enforced discipline, patrolled the barracks, and led work groups. Many were trained just down the road at a special SS training school for female guards, designed to harden them against empathy. Some arrived curious or uncertain, but cruelty quickly became the norm. One survivor described the process as a sad game. You could bet how long it would take before the new guard kicked her first prisoner. The answer was usually less than a week. Among the most feared were Irma Gress, who began her SS career at Ravensbrück before transferring to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, where she earned the nickname the Hyena of Auschwitz. Maria Mandel, known for her choir of screams, who participated in selections and executions. Herta Bothe, who beat women with wooden clubs and delighted in psychological torment. Though they wore pressed uniforms, white gloves, and embroidered collars, these accessories masked a vicious hierarchy. Guards competed for approval by demonstrating efficiency and brutality. The more violent you were, the more respected you became within SS ranks. It was understood that a woman could rise in status, not by protecting life, but by perfecting cruelty. By 1944, as the war turned against Germany, conditions in Ravensbrück deteriorated rapidly. Food rations were slashed, and starvation became policy. Trash pits became foraging grounds, and guards routinely withheld meals as punishment for minor infractions. Prisoners would trade a crust of bread for a button, a lump of sugar for a pair of socks, or a potato peel for a whispered blessing. Hunger rewired the senses. It became a drumbeat, a form of psychological warfare that broke women not just physically, but spiritually. By then, disease was everywhere. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia swept the barracks. Without medicine or rest, the sick became contagious corpses in waiting. The dead were hauled out each morning and stacked like firewood outside the barracks. One survivor described the scene: "We stopped crying. We just stepped around." Despite the horror, the women of Ravensbrück developed a secret language of resistance. Small gestures, whispered songs, coded glances. These were acts of courage, reminders of selfhood. Some survivors recall smuggling potato peels to feed the weakest, sharing stolen thread to mend another woman's uniform, taking beatings on behalf of the elderly or sick. Young women often protected older prisoners. Polish girls taught French resistors how to avoid the guards. German Jehovah's Witnesses prayed in whispers and refused to curse even as they were struck. Catholic nuns held makeshift services using memorized psalms. Soviet women taught lullabies to orphaned children. The anthropologist Germaine Tillion, who survived Ravensbrück, later wrote, "In a world engineered to destroy all compassion, the prisoners created a second world, one of quiet defiance, bound by love. That spirit would be tested again and again. And nowhere more violently than in the so-called hospital, where Nazi doctors turned prisoners into unwilling By 1942, the mask had fallen completely. Ravensbrück was no longer simply a labor camp. It had become an engine of biological annihilation. Beneath its fences, among its infirmary beds and crematorium ovens, the Nazi regime carried out one of the most calculated, silent exterminations of women in modern history. The tools of murder were varied, some scientific, others medieval. All were deliberate. Mass murder at Ravensbrück did not begin with gas chambers. It began with selections, a calm word that, in practice, meant targeted killing of the weak. In 1941, under the direction of Action T4, the Nazis began transferring Ravensbrück prisoners deemed unfit to external euthanasia centers. These transports were framed as medical evacuations, but survivors soon learned their real destination: death. One such facility was the Bernburg Psychiatric Hospital, located in Saxony. There, a gas chamber disguised as a shower waited inside a converted building. Hundreds of women from Ravensbrück were sent to Bernburg and murdered in batches, asphyxiated with carbon monoxide, then cremated. Most were sick, disabled, elderly, or pregnant. Their names disappeared into a file. Their ashes returned in urns labeled with false causes of death: heart failure, pneumonia, infection. In parallel with these external killings, Ravensbrück began conducting its own euthanasia operations inside the camp. By late 1942, doctors and guards kept lists of the chronically ill. Each week, selected women were taken, first from the hospital, then the general barracks, and injected with poisons or shot behind the wall. Their bodies were buried in mass graves behind the crematorium or reduced to ash. But perhaps the most shocking feature of Ravensbrück's machinery was its role in Nazi medical research. In 1942, a group of SS doctors, led by Dr. Karl Gebhardt, personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, began a series of surgical experiments on young Polish women known later as the rabbits. These women were chosen precisely because they were intelligent, articulate, and resistant, traits the Nazis found threatening. The experiments mimicked battlefield injuries. Doctors cut into their legs, shattered bones, infected wounds with gangrene and tetanus, then treated them with sulfa drugs or left them to rot untreated. In some cases, they amputated limbs for transplant studies or injected foreign materials, wood, glass, metal, into open wounds. Some women died from the infections. Others were executed to conceal the evidence. The rest lived with permanent disabilities, unable to walk, scarred from thigh to ankle, or emotionally destroyed. One survivor, Jadwiga Dzido, testified at the Nuremberg doctor's trial in 1946. She lifted her skirt to reveal the mutilated scar down her thigh, saying softly, "I was not told what they were doing. I only knew it hurt, and I was not allowed to scream." These were not isolated cases. Across the camp, prisoners were subjected to sterilization experiments using radiation, caustic injections, and surgical removal of reproductive lethal injection trials to test poisons under the guise of vitamin shot. Artificial insemination projects meant to explore racial purity. Dr. Gebhardt, along with his assistants, including Dr. Herta Oberheiser, the only female doctor tried at Nuremberg, were later convicted of war crimes. Oberheiser had a reputation for injecting gasoline and phenol into patients. She often performed surgeries on girls as young as 16, then watched them die. She served only 5 years in prison. As the medical experiments escalated, Ravensbrück also expanded its internal killing infrastructure. In 1943, the SS installed a crematorium on site. The furnace burned day and night. Prisoners assigned to this detail later testified they were forced to stack bodies like logs, break frozen limbs to fit them into the oven, remove gold teeth. By early 1945, with Germany's defeat looming, the killing accelerated. A primitive gas chamber was constructed in a wooden shack next to the crematorium. Using canisters of Zyklon B, the same chemical employed at Auschwitz, guards began gassing 500 to 1,000 women per week. Some transports came straight from other camps. Half-naked, diseased, skeletal women from Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. Others were local selections. Older women, mothers, children, and pregnant prisoners no longer deemed useful. The method was unceremonious, stripped of clothing, told they were taking a shower, locked in a sealed room, gas released through a vent in the roof. Their ashes were mixed in soil or dumped in the lake. Even as the Allies closed in, the SS continued these killings with methodical discipline. Between January and April 1945 alone, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 women were murdered in that small wooden shed. For the women of Ravensbrück, survival was often arbitrary. One small injury, a poorly sewn uniform, a fever. Any of these could trigger a selection. Guards were empowered to decide on the spot who lived and who died. Some women were killed because they looked too Jewish, others because they resisted work orders or defended a friend. Still others were executed for infractions as small as stealing a second slice of bread. The Nazis did not need to justify their choices. In Ravensbrück, life was not protected. It was catalogued, sorted, and discarded. Despite the enormity of the crimes, documentation was scarce by design. As the Soviets approached in April 1945, SS officers burned records, demolished files, and evacuated key witnesses. But they could not erase everything. Among the most powerful testimonies that remain are drawings by Polish survivors, depicting women collapsed during roll call, children being marched away, the gas chamber's entrance, secret diaries, smuggled out in false walls or hidden under floorboard, sworn testimonies given at post-war tribunals, many of which confirmed not just the deaths, but the cold efficiency behind them. At least 30,000 prisoners had died at Ravensbrück, possibly many more. Tens of thousands were never identified, their names lost to smoke and bureaucracy. What remained was a landscape of barracks, ovens, ashes, and memory. Despite the brutality, the starvation, and the relentless dehumanization, Ravensbrück was never a camp of silence. Beneath the layers of suffering, resistance bloomed, in quiet acts, in whispered words, in every refusal to surrender the last thread of dignity. The women of Ravensbrück did not merely endure, they fought. Women organized secret schools. Polish teachers taught math and French to teenagers in hushed voices, using chalk made from crushed brick. Others stitched forbidden symbols, small tricolor flags, stars of David, Polish eagles, into the linings of their clothes, not to be seen but to be felt. They shared crusts of bread, smuggled messages between blocks, and hid the sick from selections. Some sabotaged factory work, reversing thread patterns, weakening seams, hiding machine parts. It was dangerous. Punishment could be immediate and fatal. But even the smallest act of defiance sent a message: "You will not erase me." One group of French women organized a secret opera performance, writing lyrics on scraps of toilet paper and singing in whispers late at night. Another group conserved a small pot of jam for months, trading spoonfuls to lift spirits. These gestures, mundane by any outside standard, became, in that context, monuments of survival. Many of Ravensbrück's prisoners had already been part of organized resistance movements before their capture. These women, often young, educated, and politically engaged, continued that work inside the camp. Geneviève de Gaulle Anthonios, niece of Charles de Gaulle, was one such woman. Arrested for her role in the French resistance, she was deported to Ravensbrück in 1944. There, she became a beacon of morale for fellow prisoners, passing news of Allied advances, organizing solidarity networks, and refusing to let fear dictate her words. She later wrote, "What was unbearable was not death. It was the slow theft of our names, our dignity. And so we reclaimed them, each day in each small act." The Polish prisoners were equally steadfast. Many had survived the Warsaw Uprising or had been active in the underground university system. When transports of broken, dying women arrived from other camps, the Polish inmates shared their food, sheltered children, and smuggled medication at great personal risk. Among them were women like Wanda Poltowska, who had been one of the medical experiment victims. After her release, she became a psychiatrist, writer, and lifelong advocate for survivors, ensuring Ravensbrück would not be forgotten. By April 1945, the war was lost for the Nazis. Allied troops were closing in from the west, and the Soviet army was approaching from the east. Himmler, in a last-minute maneuver to salvage his image, allowed the Swedish Red Cross, led by Count Folke Bernadotte, to evacuate thousands of prisoners from Ravensbrück to neutral Sweden. Around 7,500 women were rescued in this operation, mostly Scandinavians, French, and a few Polish inmates. They left in white buses, emaciated and hollow-eyed, clutching each other in disbelief. For those who remained, death was still a daily threat. Camp Commandant Fritz Surin ordered a forced evacuation, a death march westward through the forests of Mecklenburg. Around 20,000 women and girls, along with a few remaining SS guards, were driven from the camp on foot, without food or water, many collapsing along the roads. On April 30th, 1945, the Soviet army arrived. They found 2,000 prisoners still inside Ravensbrück, most of them dying or already dead. Bodies filled the hospital. The crematorium still smoldered. The gas chamber stood intact. SS guards had fled into the woods, though a few were captured and turned over for trial. But for the women left behind, liberation was not a return to life. It was the beginning of another ordeal. Survivors were barely able to stand. Many weighed under 70 pounds. Most had typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, or other untreated illnesses. Hundreds died in the weeks following liberation, too weak to recover. Those who lived carried the camp with them forever. Dr. Doris Masse, a German physician imprisoned for helping Jews, later wrote, "I could eat again, I could walk again, but I could never again feel safe when I closed my eyes." The psychological toll was incalculable. Women had to rebuild their identities, often without families, homes, or even a country to return to. Some could not speak of the horror for decades. Others dedicated their lives to testifying, writing, and educating. Among the most prolific was Charlotte Delbo, a French resistance member deported to Auschwitz and later Ravensbrück. Her memoirs became foundational texts in Holocaust literature. She wrote, "I am not sure that I am still alive. I know only that I survived." In the years after the war, many of Ravensbrück's most notorious figures were brought to justice. Dr. Karl Gebhardt was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg doctors' trial and executed in 1940. Dr. Herta Oberheiser, the only female defendant at that trial, was sentenced to 20 years but served only 5. Fritz Surin, the camp's commandant, was extradited to France and executed by firing squad in 1950. Trained at Ravensbrück before her crimes at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was tried by the British and hanged at age 22. Yet many lower-ranking guards, especially women, escaped prosecution. Some faded into post-war Germany under new identities. Others lived openly, unrepentant. Today, the grounds of Ravensbrück are quiet. A memorial stands at the edge of the lake. The crematorium remains. So do the hospital blocks and barracks. Visitors walk past glass cases filled with threadbare dresses, a child's spoon, a prisoner's shoe. There are names now, tens of thousands of them, etched on stone. Polish, Russian, French, German. Each name a person, each person a story. In total, at least 30,000 people died at Ravensbrück. Many historians believe the number was far higher, but the numbers tell only part of the story. The rest is found in what the camp tried and failed to destroy: compassion, memory. As Germain Tillion wrote, "Even in that place of terror, friendship became our resistance. We were prisoners, yes, but we were also people, and we stayed that way despite everything." Ravensbrück was not just a camp for women, it was a laboratory of cruelty designed to erase womanhood itself. And yet, within that system, women rebuilt their humanity every day, through sacrifice, solidarity, and unspoken strength. The camp no longer stands as it did, but the questions remain. How could this happen? How did it persist? Who stood by and watched? Who chose to act? And most importantly, what would we do today if faced with the same line between obedience and compassion? Ravensbrück offers no easy answers, only the quiet insistence that memory is an act of resistance, and that remembering the women who suffered there is our solemn responsibility.